etc. The problem, honestly, with the gaming space is like you can do so many things. You can't or shouldn't do all.
You said content is king, but unscripted content is King Kong.
Yes, right now there is a predominance that's government money, but you will see very, very quickly that the private sector will come in.
Hello and welcome to the Business of Sports Roundtable by AGBI. I am Shruti Nair, the multimedia editor of AGBI, and on this panel with me today, I have a set of eminent guests from diverse business sports portfolios, and we are here to kick off a very exciting conversation all about the business of sports. Well, thank you very much for joining us here. So, Robin, let me kick off this entire panel with you, right? Of course, Deloitte has done multiple reports on the business of sports. So, give us an overview of what the business here looks like, especially when it comes to the global ranking of this region.
So, I mean, sports overall is definitely a very important sector and segment of basically economy, but it is also reasonably nascent in its evolution. I think what we're starting to see is definitely global interest. We are seeing in Saudi Arabia, obviously some very big names enter into the football ranks. And if I was to give basically the World Economic Forum's growth outlook of sports, 8.3% I think is the percentage here that is predicted, right? Which compares to something globally which is around 3%. So we are looking at, you know, almost three times what we would see basically internationally.
A word that has been associated with the business of sports globally has been resilient, right? When it comes to this region, would you agree?
Well, again, the question starts from where do you start? As I said, we're at a reasonably low, as far as a contribution to GDP, it's relatively low, right? And hence, when you start to think about the growth trajectory, that's why we're starting to see it kind of move to something that's more like a 2% of GDP participant. So in this region, yeah, I think it's resilient because of the upside that we're seeing. I also think the innovation that's happening within sport is actually largely coming from, not entirely, but it's coming from this region. The gentleman on my left is one of the people who's driving esports.
I am going to go to the gentleman on your left. And you're in such a dynamic industry right now, especially with all the changes that have happened in the esports space. According to reports, 65% of the population are gamers in the MENA region. That is such a wide market that you have to play with, right? But over the last decade, how would you say that esports has evolved in the region?
Well, I mean, it's been giant leaps. When we started in 2016 with Yalla Esports, the problem was to convince parents that this is, you know, like a real thing and you know, not a waste of time.
Convince your parents?
No, my parents, I mean, that's a lost case already 20 years ago. But now they're happy where I ended up. But the point being, you know, just in the decade or even 5 years, the shift and the government support in esports, you know, like it's not $1 million or so. We're talking about millions of dollars, billions of dollars, versus like 5 years ago, parents not even believing. So it's creating, you know, a lot of opportunities, jobs. I mean, I would even argue that on the health side, mental health is actually improving with gaming, not maybe physical. So you know, I 100% agree that it's much more than just sports or esports.
Would you say that esports is a lucrative business?
I mean, look, it's esports as a business is a huge spectrum, right? You can be anything from a team to the tournament organizer, even the publisher who is creating the team. So yes, I would say it's a very lucrative business.
Azhar, I'd like to come to you now. You and Paradigm Sports represent some of the biggest fight sports stars, from Conor McGregor to Manny Pacquiao, etc. My question to you, though, is what motivated you to open your offices here in Dubai?
So it was a fairly easy decision because the globalization of the sport, you needed a location which was equidistant to the capital markets of Europe and Asia. And given that our athletes represent each corner of the world, this made so much sense. I mean, the barriers to entry to setting up business here are low. It's an attractive place to set up business, and certainly from ourselves, the timing was great because I set the international office up just before the pandemic. So once the pandemic hit and sports were shut down globally, it was actually mixed martial arts and the UFC, which was the first to come back on a closed audience environment, but first to come back on TV. So we set up just before that. So we were thought to be geniuses, but it was just a timing.
Yeah, so then when you're talking about all of these stars coming into the region, what is it that they see in the region? And this might be a wider question for the table as well. And conversely, what is it that all of these big, massive stars from a Ronaldo to a Conor McGregor, either coming for the local teams here or even just playing matches here, what does it do for local talent in the region?
It's phenomenal. I mean, it's raised the level. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we did set up here, because we felt this was a region that was steeped in history when it came to combat sports, but the platform really wasn't there. So giving them motivation, giving the local talent, an aspirational global platform to leverage was one of the reasons why we set up here.
Do you see policy shifts happening that is actually driving the investments inward now?
Policy shift, I'm not sure it's policy shift. I think right now, investors are starting to see real investment opportunity in the region. Before, sports probably wasn't as well understood in this region. One, there wasn't probably a huge amount of investment opportunity, but two, there wasn't the current, there's a real torchlight that's basically now focused on this region. So unfortunately, it's about money and about returns and about all of that stuff. But I think the opportunities here are plentiful. And actually the price point to enter, which is important, is a lot lower than if you were going to buy a Premier League club in the in the UK, right? If trying to enter football at a club level in the Middle East is going to come at a different price point and therefore a different, basically, return expectation as well.
Azhar, coming to you now, one thing that you've done brilliantly as Paradigm Sports is diversifying your individual players' revenue arms or the stars' revenue arms. We've seen it either as business ventures that they've started or pre-game press conferences that's better than any live TV we've ever seen. and you've played a huge role in orchestrating those things and adding on to that pot of money that each of these players get on. Walk us through how important it is or how you as a company can diversify each player's revenue arms.
It was required because the agency business in combat sports is unregulated and ununionized. So the barriers to entry are very low. And what typically happened over the last 2 decades that the sport has really grown is that anyone can claim to be a manager. That anyone can sign a fighter and say, I'm a manager. And what they may do is sign them with the promotion, get a management fee off that. If they're lucky, they'll get some sponsorship revenue. But that's really what this business has been about. Our inflection point was really to the point in time you mentioned in 2017 where our founder and CEO, Audi Attar, architected the money fight, as it's called now, which was the first crossover fight when Conor McGregor crossed over into boxing to fight Floyd Mayweather. That was the inflection point from us from moving from traditional agency to what we define to be a platform.
Yeah, because he has evolved into a brand himself, right? We know Conor McGregor as a huge brand, and we were talking about brands earlier. But a question for the table then, obviously media has a huge role to play in all of this. But broadcast also has has had such an evolutionary trajectory, because earlier it was just about, TV rights, and where we're talking about maybe an ESPN beIN Sports. But today broadcast is not limited to that, with Facebook, with YouTube, with La Liga going on Facebook Watch, and now even on OTT platforms like Stars Play, which has got the rights for UFC Arabia, cricket, and all of that. And this question is open to the table. Where do you find the region's broadcast evolving towards, and what is the key opportunity in this space?
I mean, I'll start there, because I think that traditional broadcast here is probably behind where you would see in maybe a developed Western world, right? But if you take a look at the over-the-top platforms that are here, out of necessity, they are basically very well, very well kind of represented. If you look at smartphone penetration, some of the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world, in the GCC, and therefore the content that is being consumed tends to be not traditional linear broadcast.
But one thing I want to go back here, which was like a big thing for us, because we had the problem kind of like, okay, we want to bring and build a large event in the Middle East, but the media rights here are not basically, selling for enough money, so it was hard to make a business case. But now, when Middle East is going more and more on the map, all of a sudden you have international media bid rights. Like they want to do a Russian broadcast, or they want to do a Portuguese broadcast, or they want to do a Chinese broadcast of a Dubai-based event, for example. And then all of a sudden you get this new injection of money, and now we can do, from a business case perspective, as a company, as Yalla Esports, a event that doesn't need to cut the corners. We can do a better fan experience. We essentially have a bigger budget to produce with. Yeah. So that is definitely changing with all the investments and putting the Middle East on the map.
Are the monetizing opportunities also as huge as it is with traditional TV?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like look. Let's go into if we go into the whole creator economy, that's another beast of itself. But creators are getting smarter and smarter to monetize, and just like fighters, these esports athletes, they have probably like quite a short prime time. Then they need to figure out something else, whether they do then shampoo ads, or they create their own drinks, or whatever it is. But yeah, I always say like esports athletes, it's almost harder than top model. Like a top model has, I don't know, maybe 5 years before they become like too old or something. Some of these esports athletes, it's like 2 years. Like, you're 21, you're too old to be an esports professional. I'm like, but then you can become a content creator, you can become a streamer, you can become an analyst. Like we try to build those next layers of monetization for these digital athletes.
Let me ask you, Robin, at this point, at this juncture, what do you see is the biggest hindrance for the growth of the business of sports in this region?
The challenges to me are basically having some effectively people who will come in, make that first investment. It's already happening, and there will be people who follow. And then there's nothing to say that this region will not basically become or exceed what we are seeing in more developed regions.
Being a devil's advocate though, right? So with the kind of money that's just going into especially Saudi sports, I can't not ask what needs to be done by Saudi to avoid a situation that has happened in China, especially with football. Basically, how can Saudi ensure operational as well as financial viability of all of this money that's being pooled into one sector?
So let's look about, I'm not an expert in this area, right? But if I take a look from the outside, let's look about what is Saudi trying to do. Saudi is trying to transform its economy. Right? And that investment is being made into tourism. That investment is being made into localizing manufacturing. Ultimately, it's about shifting away from a petrochem industry into a more diversified economy. Sports is one of those things. They are relatively big bets that they're placing, and it gets the great thing about sports is it gets all the headlines. If you actually look at the investments that are being made in sports and think about that relative to some of the other investments that are being made, this is reasonably small money, right?
Where's all this money coming from, though? Although it's reasonably small compared to, the Giga projects, for example, but where?
I mean, right now, the predominance of it is government subsidy, right? That is where the predominance is, but that's with a view that private sector participation, and Prince Abdulaziz launched that in Jeddah before the summer, right? There is a desire from government to diversify, not so that government controls everything, so that the private sector come in and they give opportunities for not only Saudis, but for the international community to participate within sport and also help to build that ecosystem. So yes, right now, there is a predominance that's government money, but you will see very, very quickly that the private sector will come in.
Fair enough. Another thing though with esports is the regulatory challenges, right? I mean, one thing about being a nascent industry is that there is a lot of flexibility and wiggle room. But then are there fundamental regulatory frameworks in place that could actually encourage this more players to come from abroad or a whole ecosystem to be built around it for this region?
So that's a really, really tricky part in esports. The problem, if you compare to, let's say, sports regulation versus esports regulation, is nobody owns football. Nobody can kind of claim that we changed the rules of football. You know, you have the federations and regulatory bodies, but in gaming, somebody owns the game. It's somebody's intellectual property. They could literally change the rule of football, change the rule of game overnight, and that has happened. And then imagine if you are, let's say, an athlete who's been training all their life to do a certain thing, and you wake up one day and it's like, oh, but the dynamics change. Your favorite weapon or your whatever trick that you're used to do is completely different. You need to press another button on your keyboard because there came a new patch overnight. So that then, my point here is that the actual regulation and power in esports is actually with the publishers. So, you know, the likes of Tencent or Riot, who owns, you know, PUBG Mobile or Valorant, versus then like a traditional sport. But in the region, there's been like good discussion towards, you know, good regulation. But somebody who's been in the scene for 20 years, also I do find it a bit interesting that esports was around for a decade without any regulation except players self-regulated. Yeah. Once the money started to pour into the industry, all the regulators from government bodies got interested. Yeah. So it's like we had a very great esports scene. It was a bit grassroots and sponsorship money was small. And I always tell my friends I was, you know, 20 years early. Like when I won a tournament as a pro player in my childhood, it was like a, you know, a couple $100 and a mouse, and now it's like millions of dollars. I'm like, I wish I was born a bit later. But that was without any regulation, except like the players kind of set the rules. Because at the end of the day, we just wanted to know who's the best player. That was the main goal, you know? Yeah. And then it became an industry.
You mentioned it earlier, which is about job creation. There is such a boost that is being given by sports to the economy. Robin, would you be able to share with us about how exactly advancing the sports ecosystem in this region could actually be beneficial for the wider economy and also for the people within the countries?
Yeah, 100%. So, great question, and I think it exists on multiple levels. So there is at the very core, right, there is acquiring a club or making an investment, and so those investors themselves will obviously benefit, but also they will inject capital into that club, which does create job opportunities where we start to move to something that is leveraging and professionalizing within the sports clubs. You then basically move around that game, right? You then have got the fan experience, you've got the F&B experience that sits around it. Again, more products, more GDP contribution, more job creation. You then kind of move into the production of kit, right? We talk about merchandise. We talk about if it was a javelin, whatever it is, right? Yeah. So there's the opportunity for people to then start to manufacture in region and basically distribute in region, right? And then you get the multiplier effect, right? So we have our economic advisors within Deloitte, and we start to then talk about basically our multiples, our multiplier effects. And those are tax receipts, those are basically travel in, there are boosts to tourism. And then the last thing I'll touch on is then basically, and we've already talked a bit, like the social inclusion, which I would basically have an alliance to basically mental health as well, but also physical. As people start to move into seeing football to then actually playing football, seeing basically jiu-jitsu to actually participating in jiu-jitsu, healthcare outcomes, social inclusion starts to basically improve, which actually reduces the healthcare burden. When I have a football club, right? Self-declared Chelsea fan, right? It's not going so well at the moment.
Sorry,
right?
feel sorry for you.
Exactly. But if you take a look at a lot of people that are from or grew up in this region, they identify with a player. They've got a very, very different way of looking. So they might be a Mo Salah fan, and when he moved from Chelsea to Liverpool, right? They moved their allegiances from Chelsea to Liverpool, right? So bringing those kind of, they are brands that we've talked about, Conor McGregor. These guys all have their own identity, and actually their brand value in many cases is much bigger than the club.
I'm also seeing a generational shift, which is benefiting this region now. we grew up following football teams, and my allegiance is on the north side of London at Arsenal, right? But and I would unwaveringly support that team, regardless of who played for them. The current generation doesn't really attach themselves that way to football clubs anymore. It's more around individuals. So our process of building that athlete brand and having them own their IP, you're going to see the more athletes come into this region, it's going to, there's going to be a trickle-down economy for the region as a whole. I mean, I'll give you an example. When Conor fights in Las Vegas, the economic output of Las Vegas goes up 3.24x just when he fights.
Oh, wow.
Because the hotels are full,
Yeah.
the restaurants are full, the bars are full, the casinos are full. So we see that here. When he fought here, I'd say January 21, in the UFC event, the prime seats were $10,000 each. They were sold out in 10 minutes. So people gravitate to these megastars, and the region will benefit significantly from an economic output as a consequence.
Just before we close the panel, one last question for all of you and the poll as well, is do you think the World Cup 2030 is going to happen in Saudi Arabia?
So I'm going to say, look, right now, who can afford to host some of these events, right? And again, in this region, we have the benefits of basically a lot of political will and investment. And, there are other areas where maybe that will is not there. So I actually think, I'll go broader than just that. I think there's going to be a lot of mega events that are going to play out of this region.
So that's a
I
yes.
agree.
It's a major yes.
Completely agree. I mean, it's also the convergence of the different economic blueprints that Saudi has, that the UAE has around 2030 and beyond, right? So that natural convergence, it makes it very hard to ignore the fact that there could be a World Cup there. And I agree. I mean, I've been to 3 World Cups all over the world, and the Qatar one's the one I thought was fantastically organized.
You've got to remember also the logistics of getting here, right? Very well invested, basically, hotels, right? We've got some of the best airlines in the world that are all destined here. If you take a look at Emirates, you look at Etihad, you look at basically the emergence in Saudi of some new airlines, you look at Qatar Airways. We've got, if you want to get here, it's easy, right? If you take a look at some places that have hosted large events, I mean, I know there's one where there was only one from the UK to get there was 1 flight a week, right? I think that was the Champions League final in Azerbaijan, right? You've got to remember, right? We're in the middle of the world. The hint's in the name, right? We're in the Middle East. So everybody kind of can come through here. And I think that provides not only for here, but also as a basically destination of choice so that people from outside of region can participate.
A lot of optimism here. On that note, I have to say thank you very much for joining us here on this panel. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for watching AGBI's Business of Sports Roundtable.